sometimes different cultures have to be talked about when thinking about a team and all that. And, from one culture to another for relocation and all that. For basketball, it's the double culture. Minneapolis moving to LA into Tinseltown and all that. And New Orleans moving to Utah with the fact that Utah doesn't really have anything to do with jazz. They're more about the Mormon faith and all that. For football, it's got to be Cleveland to Baltimore for obvious reasons because, the Cleveland Browns were a legendary team. They moved to Baltimore, and then the NFL decided to make Baltimore, quote unquote, an expansion team and allowed Cleveland to get a chance in 1999 to get players, all that. And in baseball, of course, the double New York move to California, the New York Giants moving to San Francisco, and the LA Dodgers moving to, well, the Brooklyn Dodgers moving to LA. But for all that, hockey is a fickle sport. And for a lot of people, this has to do with the city that lost its team and moved to another city. But not only did it transfer between countries, it transferred between languages. This is the story of the final Quebec Nordiques team in history, the 1994-95 squad, before they moved to Colorado. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter with NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name. And I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! So anyway, the Quebec Nordiques were founded as a WHA World Hockey Association team. Now, of course, you'll be probably thinking, is Jeff going to do anything in French? Not completely. I already did the French and English stuff for the 94 Montreal Expos, and I had to use Google Translate as a script. But the fact of the matter is that the Nordiques were a WHA squad. But the funny thing is, people forget that the Quebec Nordiques were not supposed to start as a WHA team. Well, we all know Quebec City, and they had a great hockey pedigree because they had a great senior hockey team. In fact, that senior hockey team was so popular that Jean Beliveau, the good old Bill, he actually rejected Montreal Canadiens' offers for him to leave the Quebec Aces and join the Montreal Canadiens. He said he was comfortable. Quebec City gave him a car. He was dating a girl from Quebec City, and he got a house. So Montreal decided not only to offer Belleville everything in the form vault, but practically to buy the Quebec League and making it under Montreal rule. So basically, Montreal controlled it just to get Belleville. But the Quebec Aces were very big in the AHL and all that. Lots of things happened. But yeah, Quebec City got the WHA. But what people forget about the thing is that the Nordiques actually weren't the original home of that WHA franchise. The WHA franchise that became the Quebec Nordiques was actually set in stone for San Francisco. But San Francisco had some problems with stuff, so they moved to Quebec City, moved it to Canada. Finally, a move from America to Canada. Actually, it also happened in the WHA when Philadelphia moved after the first season to Vancouver. Nevertheless, this is about Quebec. So the Nordiques looked good. They had a basic French Canadian roster and all that. If you look at the 1972 and 73 squad, well, the first few seasons, especially in the WHA, their squad was primarily French, like French Canadian and all that, even the goalies. Because, they were representing French Canada with their sports pedigree, whereas the Canadians can have the English fans. So, yeah, the Nordiques did quite well. A few AFCO Cups, WHA championships, and they had JC Tremblay, Mark Tartif, and who was the other guy who was a Quebec legend? Jacques Richard? I don't think so. But regardless of that, The Nordiques were added into the NHL as one of the 4 teams in 1979, alongside Edmonton, Hartford, and Winnipeg. Ironic that all but Edmonton would move at one time or another. The fact of the matter is that the Nordiques were placed in a massive rivalry with the Montreal Canadiens. They had to. In fact, the second Quebec Nordiques game in history after a game against the Calgary Flames, no, the Atlanta Flames, excuse me, because Calgary didn't have the team yet. They would have the Nordiques go to Montreal to face the Canadiens at the famous Forum in their second game, and this game would be massively, provincially broadcast. So Quebec and Montreal had their rivalry and all that. You know, you had French Canada cheering for French Quebec cheering for Montreal. I mean for Quebec City, and the English side cheering for Montreal. And not only that, they were sponsored by different beer companies. Montreal was a Molson company, backed by Molson. Quebec by Carling. In fact, the beer thing kind of nearly had things going. Now, the NHL decided to merge. Now, there were rumors circulating that some teams were going to say no. Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, the 3 NHL teams voted against the merger. And people like in Winnipeg and Quebec were fuming because of and Edmonton were fuming because, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver did not want to share the revenue. And also due to the fact that Quebec was, represented by Carling O'Keefe. And Molson was not too pleased about it. Molson representatives were not too pleased. But however, the Vancouver representative was actually told to vote yes for the merger, but he voted no, thinking that was what it was. He was a close friend to Arthur Griffiths, who was the president of the Canucks. When Griffiths heard about that result, he fired his best friend, and Molson breweries were given death threats and vandalism for that. Nevertheless, the Nordiques and the Habs would be playing. They would face each other in the 1982 division finals when both Quebec and Montreal won their first round series. It was a brutal series which ended in Game 5 when Dale Hunter, the scorn and the piece of shit who coaches the London Knights, scored the winning goal in overtime. Just under Rick Wamsley's pad, and Danny Gallivan and Bobby Hall were calling the game for CBC, and Danny says, "How did that puck go in?" And then Bobby Hall goes, "Danny, that puck's in the net." And then Quebec was celebrating like it went in the net, and it did. It just went into the net. Quebec would go on to get their butts handed to them by the Islanders in the conference finals. But 2 years later, they would fight again. Montreal and Quebec, both winning their first round series, and now having to face each other again in the second round or the division finals. It was a tight affair, but Game 6 would be known as the Bataille Saint Vendredi, the Good Friday Massacre, where almost every player got into a scrap and all that, including the goalies, even the third goalies, like the goalies who are third on the depth chart were fighting. So those guys were fighting tooth and nail and massive penalties and all that. The worst part was that Bruce Hood and his officials forgot to tell the teams who was ejected from the first brawl. And of course, that was when Sean Hamel got the shit beaten out of him and all that by Louis Slager. But yeah, the officials forgot to tell the 2 teams, Montreal and Quebec, who was going to be thrown out. And then they fought before the third period even started. Montreal would go on to beat Quebec and move on to the conference finals, give the others a scare, but lose in 6. 1985, they would meet again in the Adams Division playoffs, in the Adams final, and in Game 7 in Montreal, Peter Stastny scored the key goal in overtime to sink the Canadiens. So that was that. The simple fact was that the Nordiques and Habs would fight in 1987 with the Habs coming out on top. But people forget how good that rivalry was. It was massive. Unfortunately, Montreal and Quebec went their separate ways. Montreal got better, Quebec got worse very badly. They even won what 12 games in 1990, and they had like six different goalies. That's how pathetic they were. But the Nordiques got the number one pick and got Olin Nolan. In 1991, they sucked again. They were the worst team in the NHL, so they got Eric Lindros, but Lindros refused to play for them. Of course, the whole narrative was that Lindros refused to go to French Canada. But Lindros later said it wasn't completely true. It was because he didn't trust the Obu family. And Lindros had the ultimate helicopter hockey parents, aka Carl and Bonnie Lindros. I won't go much into detail, but those guys really were too invested in Eric's time and all that. Where he played and what line he was on. So Lindros sat and wait, went to the OHL, and went to the Canadian Hockey Olympic team thing for 92 in Albertville. Quebec was basically told that they had to do something about Lindros or else they'll probably lose him in the 93 draft. So Quebec traded his rights to Philadelphia after a botched move to the Rangers. They traded him to Philadelphia and came out on top in a sense. They got Ron Hextall, a proven hockey goalie. They got Chris Simon, who was a decent player. They got Mike Ricci, who became big for Quebec. And of course, the biggest move of all, they got Peter Forsberg. And yeah, Peter Forsberg was a Flyers draft pick, but when he got to Quebec, man, he was good. So the Nordiques turned their fortunes around in 93, becoming second in the division and hosting Montreal in the playoffs, like having home ice advantage. They won the first two games, and everyone wanted Patrick Roy benched. Demers said no, obviously, because the opposite would be Andre Red Light Rasico. But long story short, the Habs won games 3, 4, 5, and 6, sunk the Nordiques. And then, of course, we talked about the 95 Nordiques the last time they made the playoffs. And then they would move to Colorado to become the Avalanche, but that's a different story. So let's talk about the 95 Nordiques, why don't we? All right, so the 94-95 Quebec season, it was their 23rd season of operation and what would have been the last season played in Quebec. The Nordiques were the best team in the Eastern Conference, but yet fell in the first round. They exploded out of the gate, winning 12 of their first 13. They were terrible on the road, but at home they were 19-1-4, and it also helped them that they would play every team in the Eastern Conference. The Western Conference would not be played because of the strike shortened season. They lost to naturally Pittsburgh, who was fighting them for the Northeast Division crown at home. But anyway, Sakic would be fourth in points. Nolan would be third in goals. And Peter Forsberg would win the Calder for Rookie of the Year in 95. They were looking pretty impressive. They were tops in the division and the conference with 65 points, 30, 13, and 5. So anyway, Quebec, well, Pittsburgh would have been second because they had the second most points, but because Philadelphia was in the Atlantic Division, so Quebec and Philly were the two teams winning division teams. Pittsburgh would be number 3, Boston 4, New Jersey 5, Washington 6, Buffalo 7, and the Rangers sneaking in over Florida by a point. The Nordiques faced the Rangers and it looked pretty good because, they had a good record. The Rangers were having the Stanley Cup hangover and all that. But a lot of people said that the playoff experience was why the Rangers had Quebec easily beaten in 6 games. Quebec won game 1 on a last-minute goal by Joe Sakic and then lost 3 straight games, including one in overtime. When game 4 was the game in which they thought they had a goal, but Kovalev was down on the ice, but Kovalev was being a diving bastard. Quebec would win game 5 at home, but lost in MSG. Stéphane Fiset and Justin Tipo would be the main goalies and all that, both in the playoffs and in the regular season. Mark Crawford was named the Jack Adams winner for top coach. They didn't make too many major moves during the trade deadline in 95. They even took Wade Belak in the first round of the 94 draft, a right winger from Saskatoon, which was weird because, Wade Belak was much more maligned as a goon, as you will, and sadly died in 2011. They drafted Chris Drury in the third round from Fairfield Prep School in Connecticut. And Milan Hayduke was drafted in the 94 draft by Quebec, fourth round from Party Boys. Of course, the '94 NHL draft was also the draft that Quebec traded Matt Sundin to Toronto for Wendell Clark. So yeah, Chris Drury was on the drafted from the '94 Nordiques, and Milan Hajduk as well. And Tim Thomas, ninth round pick from the University of Vermont. Can you believe it? Tim Thomas was actually drafted by the Quebec Nordiques, but he languished in Europe and in the AHL, and then finally in the late 2000s he became a good goalie. So anyway, the relocation to Denver was huge and all that. It was the swan song. The financial troubles took center stage. There was fan support and all that, but Quebec City was the second smallest market in North America to have a Big Four team. Green Bay being the only one behind them. The league's Canadian teams found it difficult to compete in the new age of rising player salaries because the Canadian dollar sucked. And of course, other than the marketability, the problem was that there is no privately owned English language radio stations and one privately owned English language TV station in the city. And the PA announcements were only in French. At a time, they actually did do this whole PA announcement thing, but they also said, but the NHL decreed that the visiting bench would have like kind of a kind of a sound thing that basically they would a speaker that they'll give the announcements in English. Abu wanted a bailout from Quebec's provincial government, but failed miserably. Not only that, the province of Quebec was also worried about the fact that they wanted to separate. They had a referendum, and Quebec, staying in Canada, would have won out. Abu was forced to sell the team to Denver, and lo and behold, the Avalanche won the Stanley Cup the first year from after Quebec City and all that. Yeah, the Nordiques were gonna revamp their uniforms, and they looked cool, as you can see the logo. But yeah, the Avalanche won the first Stanley Cup, and who knows if if the Nordiques stayed in Quebec, I doubt they would have been able to get Patrick Roy from the Canadians. Like Montreal's going to trade anybody from their team to their hated rivals. But yeah, the whole English system was kind of also a big issue too. So anyway, let's talk about what if the '95 Nordiques actually beat the Rangers in the first round? How would they do in the second round onwards, if there is an onwards? Anyway, so for hockey, the '94-'95 New Jersey Devils would take on the '94-'95 Quebec Nordiques. Now, the reason being is that the number two seed Pittsburgh Penguins won, and the number two Philadelphia Flyers and the number three Penguins won. So Nordiques being number one, so it would have been 1, 2, 3, 5. So almost every higher seeded team would have won, except for Boston, who lost to the Devils in the first round. So this is how everything would work out. The Nordiques would be hosting the Devils as the number one seed. So yeah, let's see if they could stop Brodeur, who idolized Quebec-born goalies. Stéphane Fiset got game one, and game one saw the Devils go into Quebec and win. Chris Simon didn't do himself any favors at 225, cross-checking and getting the gate. Bruce Driver scored on the power play. John McClain made it 2-0 Devils, and then Scott Young made it 2-1. But the Devils got two goals by Stéphane Richer and Brian Ralston. Not a lot of time for Claude Lemieux. He only got 9 minutes in action. Bill Lang will be pissed off about that. Danton Cole got 3 minutes. Reed Simpson for the Devils. The Nordiques give Chris Simon 28 seconds, but he got ejected. Paul McDermott got 9 minutes. Andrei Kovalenko 10 minutes. The three stars Brodeur, Richer, and McLean. Match number two would see the Nordiques narrowly win 2-1. Forsberg and Stephen Finn, remember him, the former captain of the Nordiques, made it 2-0, and then Neil Broaden made it 2-1. Close game and all that. Lots of players. Every player got 13 minutes, including Chris Simon, who didn't get ejected this time. Vise, Brodeur, and Broden are your three stars. So game three at the Swamp would see the Devils lose 4-2 as Mike Ricci scored. making 1-0. Unfortunately, though, near the end of the period, Chris Simon got a 5-minute major for charging, game misconduct. Devils could only counter once. Tom Shorsky. Scott Young and Forsberg made it 3-1. Stefan Riger made it 3-2, but Paul McDermott made it 4-2, and that was it. Chris Simon getting ejected. Forsberg, Kaminsky, and Scott Young are your 3 stars. So game 4, let's see the Devils lose 4-3 as the Nordiques would do it. John McLean and Valerie Kaminsky scored. Chris Simon, for the 3rd time in 4 games, would get the gate for a penalty, but Devils didn't do anything. Stefan Richer made it 2-2. Neil Broda made it 3-2 with a minute and a half left, and it looked like the Devils were going to tie the series. But the Nordiques win the game. Sakic scored a system of Roulin, and Vizay goes into the net. Despite Olin Nolan being in the box for elbowing, Devils couldn't capitalize. And then Claude Lapointe passed to Martin Rushinsky, who passed to Curtis Decision, and number 7 scored for the Nordiques in overtime. The 3 stars, Frise, Sakic, and Broughton. So the Nordiques are up 3-1 headed home. Game 5 sees the Nordiques win again in overtime as Stefan Richer and John McLean scored in the first period for the Devils. The Nordiques had Lecision and Scott Young. Chris Simon took 2-minute penalty. Wendell Clark made it 3-3 at 12:58. And then the game went on and on and on. The Devils and Nordiques would have coincidental penalties. Stevens and Foot would be called. Claude Lemieux got in trouble for high sticking, and then there would be a fight between Yui Krupp and Mike Peluso. Candanico went off for elbowing, but the Nordiques could not take advantage. Kaminsky and Wendell Clark went off for penalties, but Mike Ricci at 7:20 of double overtime, or practically 27:20 of overtime, scored the goal. Denton Coleman at 54. Yeah. Everyone played at least 15 minutes for Quebec. Greenland got hurt. Lecision, Brodeur, Fise are your 3 stars, but yeah, Mike Ricci was the hero in double overtime. So the Nordiques would move on. Now, the question remains, what do you do? Well, assuming the Flyers did make the Eastern Finals in real life. Assuming that, the Flyers are the Flyers and all that, you know, they would have played the Nordiques. So yeah, this would have been a crazy narrative for Philly and Quebec because you have like Ron Hextall versus his former team, against Peter Forsberg in the former squads, and Eric Lindros would head to Quebec. Game 1 would see the Nordiques win 7-1. Nolan, Renberg, and Lefebvre would be the goal scorers. Sakic made it 3-1. Foot made it 4-1. Scott Young at 3:37 of the 3rd made it 5-1. And Hextall would have to be replaced. Ricci and Simon would score. Yeah, Chris Simon, he behaved himself this time. Lefebvre, Nolan, and Sakic are your 3 stars. So Quebec would have been up 1-0. Game 2 would see the Nordiques once again crush it 5-1. Stefan Fise playing like a man possessed. Brendan Moore made it 1-0, but Stephen Finn and Craig Llewellyn in the first few periods. Nolan, Sakic, and Forsberg made it 5-1. Nolan, Llewellyn, and Clark are your 3 stars. Game 3 in Philadelphia. These the Nordiques win again 5-1. As Nolan, Kovalenko, and McDermott would score for the Nordiques. What was crazy was that both Dave Brown and Rob DeMaio were in the box for penalties, and then Eric Lindros, 5-on-3 scored, 3-on-5 scored a goal. Scott Young made it 4-1. Mulan made it 5-1. Hextall was gone. Dave Brown got in trouble for diving. Dominic Roussel, 2nd star for 27 saves. So he's probably going to be coming into the game. I mean, they have nothing to lose. Quebec would win in overtime. Forsberg scored for Quebec, then Deneen. Double-minded for Wendell Clark. And the Flyers took advantage with one. Josef Baranek. Peter Forsberg made it 2-2. Kaminsky made it 3-2. Rob DeMaio made it 3-3. And in overtime, even though Clark got a penalty for boarding, he got the winning goal from Sakic and Lecision. Took out the Flyers, and the Nordiques would be going to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Detroit Red Wings. 3 stars, Forsberg, Fise, and Kamensky. Man, Fise's been on fire. That's been on freaking fire. So, knowing that Detroit Red Wings were the top team in 1985, top team in 1995, they had more wins. Mike Fernan, Fedorov, Cicerelli, Yzerman. Thank you. Yeah, Yzerman will be on the top line. So, Nordiques Red Wings, Detroit had more points. Game 1 at Joe Louis saw the Nordiques win in overtime. Dino Cicerelli scoring for the Red Wings. Then Sakic and Kolenko made it 2-1. Sean Burr on the power play 2-2. Sakic made it 3-2. But the Nordiques left too much time on the clock, and Keith Primo scored with less than a minute left. And in overtime at 8:41, Kovalenko, the future habitant in the Patrick Watt deal from Mike Ricci. Yeah, Detroit. Slava Fetisov only played a minute 23. That doesn't sound right. Slava Kozlov 45 seconds. Stu Gibbs a minute 21. Dan McCarty 12 seconds. Really? Kovalenko, Sakic, and Primo are your 3 stars. Game 2. Would see the Nordiques win again in overtime. Kovalenko and Primo scored in the first period. Few penalties and an overtime decision from Young and Forsberg. And Quebec seems to win games in overtime left, right, and center. Fusé, Ferdinand, and Decision are your 3 stars of the game. We head back to Laval Provence for game 3. And it would be the Nordiques. Well, they were up 4-1. Olin Nolan scoring 3 of the 4 goals in the first. Mike Ricci also scoring for the Nordiques. Better off for the Red Wings. Lidstrom made it 4-2, and then Kamensky scored, and Ferdinand would be replaced by Osgood. Sakic would score, make it 6-2. Konstantinov made it 6-3, and Yzerman made it 6-4, but too little too late. As Osgood would do well in relief. Nolan, Sakic, and Kadak, your 3 stars. And finally, we will have ourselves a game 4. Osgood in the net. What do you have to lose? And they win. Shepard, Fedorov, and Cicerelli scored, and the Nordiques will have to go to game 5 in Detroit. Nice job by Osgood cutting the shutout. Fedorov and Cicerelli. Is Osgood going to be the key ingredient when they go home? The answer is yes. The Red Wings win in overtime. Chris Simon got ejected for the 4th time in the playoff run. Primo scored first, and then Young and Fedorov. Clark made it 2-2. Erie made it 3-2. Kovalenko made it 3-3. Yzerman made it 4-3. Late Kamensky made it 4-4, but in overtime at 12:29, Shepard from Primo 5-4 Red Wings. 3 stars: Osgood, Kamensky, and Fedorov. Osgood proving that maybe a change of goalie was what they needed. Game 6 would see the Red Wings come back to win 5-2. Wow. Kamensky scoring for Quebec, but Fedorov made it 1-1. Then Fedorov scored 2-1. Then Paul Coffey. Kitchener, look it up. 3-1. Kovalenko made it 3-2. Fedorov finishes a hat trick, and Paul Coffey, Kitchener, is second of the night. 3 stars: Fedorov, Coffey, and Cicerelli. So unbelievable. We are going to game 7 in Detroit. And Quebec wins. Nolan scores, and somehow the Quebec Nordiques avoid the reverse sweep and win game 7. So the Nordiques do win game 7 against Detroit. It's holy freaking Trinity. Fise, Nolan, and Osgood were the 3 stars, but man, Stefan Fise remembered who the hell he was. Without him, Quebec would not have gone that far. And the Nordiques would have won the Stanley Cup and say, fuck you, America, and fuck you, Bettman, because we got the cup. Anyhow, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do